Welcome back to our Economics of Regulation course. Today we are going to discuss incentive regulation, Chapter 8. Last week we learned that cost of service regulation, the old traditional way to regulate natural monopolies or utilities, and rate of return regulation, might give firms strategic incentives to act in a way that they inflate their costs, they overinvest in capital in order to increase their profits. We speak here of gold-plated networks, for instance. And today, in the next 2 weeks or so, we are going to discuss how regulation acted to that, what new ways to regulate were developed, and in particular, we will focus on what is called incentive regulation. I first want to give you an overview of how practical policies look like with this incentive regulation. And then here with point 8.1, I start, I didn't want to jump, I just wanted to highlight this. We start with some theoretical background, and in chapters 9 and 10, we are pretty much discussing theoretical approaches, how to deal with these strategic effects. And of course, these strategic effects arise from the fact that we have asymmetric information. So the regulated company can hide its actions, can hide information from the regulator. The regulator cannot find out certain features of the monopolist or of its actions. And after also discussing some other points, we will then look into what practical policy does if it introduces this kind of incentive regulation. Okay, that's the topic for today, incentive regulation, and I just want to give you an overview and somehow justify what I always told you in terms of that cost of service regulation, in a sense, was the dominant regulatory paradigm of, say, the last century. You saw up to 1985, and this is an example of the telecom regulation in the US. It's a local telecom industry which is considered, or was long considered, natural monopoly, in a sense that we should have only a single firm being active there. And we saw probably I should give you the next slide where I just put it in terms of figures here. This is just the illustration here. So we see here the number of US states over the years starting from 1985 going up to the recent past in 2007, and up to 1985, and of course earlier times, all states actually had a cost of service regulation with some allowed rate of return. And then in the mid-80s, the development started. You see at some time they started to introduce some kind of, this would be this red one, some kind of pool rate freezes and a rate case moratoria. On the next slide, I will explain in more detail what that is or what the different concepts are. Then we had the gray line with here this start of earnings sharing regulation, and starting, so to say, in the early 90s, in a sense, we had really the paradigm shift, and we got now price cap regulation, which in a sense then became the dominant form of regulation of telecoms. Now you see, I just recently or yesterday updated this. Now we have a trend backwards. The number of states who use this paradigm is decreasing. The reason here simply is that in some states we already saw deregulation of local telecommunications industry or local telecom incumbents, because now we have infrastructure or facilities-based competition, like from cable TV companies, like from mobile telecom companies. So what this was supposed to highlight is really this shift from cost of service regulation to other forms of regulation, and in particular then finally ending up in or with poor price cap regulation. Here I just want to show you these different types, or describe or define as different types of what is also called performance-based regulation. Performance-based regulation is just a synonym for incentive regulation. So first of all, price cap regulation, and I'm certain that I spoke about that before. Price cap regulation typically specifies some commitment period. You saw in German incentive regulation for electricity and gas, it's also a 5-year period. And in this period, the regulated company can adjust its rates as long as, on average, it rises no faster than inflation less a productivity offset. This is this famous RPI minus X. We will discuss that in much more detail, but the point is actually price cap regulation actually prescribes a certain fixed price cap. And of course, it then has to take into account that over time, the environment might change, labor costs might increase as general inflation does, and therefore it typically allows regulated companies to increase prices slightly. We will, in the chapter on practical policies, at some length discuss what price cap regulation is, and we look into different ways like tariff basket regulation and so on. But it should be clear for the moment. The rate freeze should be very clear. It just means that the company cannot change its price during this period. Okay, and rate freeze moratorium is a very specific US thing where you just say, okay, the regulated tariffs are determined at a rate case every 5 years, and if I don't have a new rate case, the rates cannot be changed. And so this is very specific there that you might have small changes. What is rather interesting is so-called earnings sharing plan. We will get back to that later. I think in the notes I give you some example from Europe. What this means, it implements some explicit sharing of realized earnings between the regulated firm and its customers. So if it turns out, if you have a fixed price and it turns out that your prices have gone down and you have would have some what we could call windfall profits, typically the firm has to pay back some part of that by way of lower tariffs to the consumers. Okay, the companies achieved earnings in excess of a predetermined threshold. We have that as a way of what is called clawback mechanism. In EU regulation. If you think of subsidization of some broadband projects, you have some municipality, some rural area where some incumbent like Deutsche Telekom receives some subsidy in order to build up a network. And typically it assumes that you have a certain percentage of consumers buying this product. Then if the percentage is much higher and it turns out that it's much more profitable, you would have to pay back part of the subsidies you receive. That would be something like earnings sharing here. Okay, yeah, here's just some further details that the point is, or the actually point is that if it turns out that these companies make huge profits, this is just not politically acceptable over a longer time period, and therefore you have this sharing. Okay, hopefully it's somehow clear. Now we go more into a little bit of the detail and define that more closely. So what is incentive regulation or performance-based regulation? It's the implementation of rules. It includes explicit financial incentives, and these rules should encourage a regulated firm to achieve certain performance goals while it affords the firm significant discretion or leeway in how the goals are achieved. Okay, what does this mean? The discretion should enable the firm to employ its superior knowledge. It knows better about consumer demand, typically about demand of broadband customers in some rural, or for broadband in some rural area, for instance. It knows better about its cost characteristics and so on. And it should use this superior knowledge, and this if that superior knowledge leads to superior performance, you might earn more of course, than some allowed rate of return. So you earn more than its target return if you are doing rather well. However, of course, you also have the risk of earning less than the target return. Remember, I could jump back, or probably I won't find that immediately. Remember what we discussed, this German incentive regulation price formula for the revenue cap, where you had some efficiency factors and so on. And of course, if you did good in terms of the efficiency, if you had higher efficiency, you would get a higher profit. If you have lower efficiency, you get lower profit. So what is the big difference between this performance-based regulation compared to cost of service regulation? So here you now have explicit financial incentives, and it affords more discretion to the regulated firm. So here it's not yet clear what the discretion is. We will get more into that once we discuss, for instance, like tariff basket regulation, where you can rebalance your tariffs. So you might have higher prices for local calls and lower prices for distance calls, for instance. But the point here is that you can earn more if you do well, if you are able to decrease your cost, for instance. And the point, or the most important point, is the relation between what the company can charge, and therefore what its revenue is, and its realized operating cost. Under cost of service regulation, that's clear. If your costs increase, you get a higher revenue requirement, and you are allowed to charge a higher price. Under performance-based regulation or incentive regulation, this link is partially severed. That is, higher costs are typically not reimbursed, and this creates a stronger incentives for a company to reduce its costs, because if the regulator sees that your costs reduce, you're nevertheless allowed to charge your old tariff, and you get your old revenue, okay, and therefore can increase your profit. Yeah, theory. Why do we need that? And now again, I'm pretty much telling what I already told you. That this is a bit redundant here, probably. So the starting point here, if you want to analyze this problem, is that the regulator has imperfect information. You know, the asymmetric information problem, and it doesn't know cost opportunities and how the firm behave, and it doesn't know demand. And the regulated firm has superior knowledge. That's what we told. And the problem is that, as always, the regulated firm might use this information advantage strategically in order to cheat, and in order to tell the regulator that it has higher cost than it actually has, or in order that to tell the regulator that it worked hard even though it didn't. Okay, and that, of course, would then be to the disadvantage of consumers. So you see, economists are always rather cynical. They assume that if firms benefit from lying, they would lie. Okay, additional problem here. The regulated firm or other interest groups might be able to capture the regulator. What does that mean? Capture, I think we already discussed that before. Yeah, you just would bribe the regulator and tell the regulator, okay, you don't directly pay, but once your tenure as at the regulator ends, you get a wonderful job at, say, Gazprom as an advisor, or on a board of directors, or something like that. That would be capture. Capture, however, can also have the form of a regulatory hold-up. European mobile phone companies introduced made all the investments to get international roaming, and then the European regulator said, oh no, we don't want that. We want that our customers can make calls all over Europe at the same price as if they were at home, and you just are not reimbursed for that. That would be something like at least slightly expropriation. We have that in many developing countries, where if you build some infrastructure, you might get, and if there's a change in the government, you might get expropriated and thrown out of the countries. So this is another problem. The last point is that regulation is a repeated game. Okay, the world doesn't end after the first 5-year period, of the first commitment period. The regulator learns something over time here, and it learns about the attributes. So the point is, if it learns today that it has low cost, of course it knows in the next period that it has low cost, and that provides further incentives because you really have farsighted here. You have to take into account as a company that the world doesn't end after 5 years. And at the same time, the regulated firm develops a reputation about the credibility of its claims. If the regulator found out that it really made wrong cost statements in the first regulatory period, it won't trust in the statements they make in the next period. Incentive theory, incentive regulation was really a huge stream of work in the last, say, even 40 years. You saw that it only started in practice, say, with price cap regulation in the mid-80s, with Stephen Littlechild in the United Kingdom, in electricity and telecoms regulation, but then in the 90s in the US. But also, of course, there was ongoing theoretical contributions to that. And these recent theoretical contributions on these optimal incentive regulation deals with many different problems. It deals, of course, with the asymmetric information problem. It deals with what is called contracting constraints. We will get back to that later. Credibility issues. Is it really credible if you say you get paid now for the next 20 years, these 8.5%, or you're allowed this 8.5% rate of return? There's regulatory capture, dynamic considerations. That's pretty much very similar. And the instruments or the methods which these theories and these approaches used were the modern theory of finance. Like you learn just what we discussed about WACC, about CAP-M, and so on. An important part is mechanism design theory. You will see in the part on adverse selection, where we will present the model of Roger Myerson, who received the Nobel Prize for his work on mechanism design in 2007. We have auction theory. We will discuss that when we have discuss franchise contracts and so on. Contract theory should be clear. And modern political economy, which allows to analyze capture and something like that. And we assume adverse selection, moral hazard, hold up if you make an investment, and so on. And you will see many of these points in the coming chapters. The topic is always that you want to derive second best mechanism to achieve some public interest goals. Public interest goal just meaning that you want to maximize welfare. And the evaluation of all these important literature, or all these vast literature by Josker, is not so positive. He says that this has become a vast literature, some of which is relevant to actual regulatory problems and practice, and however, much of it is not. Okay, so there is too much, probably too many PhD students did work on that and did that twist and this twist. For practical regulators, it's not always clear what they really learn from these exercises. Nevertheless, these exercises or these approaches are at times rather abstract, but you will nevertheless have to go through the most important ones as they really learn to think about the basic of this model, about the working, and about how to deal with asymmetric information and the problems. Okay, and in particular, of course, if you want to get a job in some of these regulated companies or at a regulator, you should be aware of these literature. Okay, here now just an illustration of what the basic problem is, and we have now two different versions, namely adverse selection and moral hazard. Okay, so the point is, or the starting point of all that is always asymmetric information. Okay, if the regulator knows everything, we don't have any problems, and we just can run our standard kind of welfare maximization, set Ramsey Porter prices, set any prices you want, and no problem at all. So the problem is always that if you're not perfectly informed. And adverse selection, what does this mean? A firm's costs may be high or low. Okay, you don't know whether the firm's costs are high or low actually, and it depends on some attributes of the production function. You have some exogenous cost variations and so on, and you don't know what exactly the cost difference is between urban and rural areas. Okay, and therefore you get different costs, so you don't know how exactly the costs are of the Elbphilharmonie or of the Berlin airport. And the firm should probably know better whether it's high or low. And the regulator has only some information. In particular, she knows something about the probability distribution. Is it very likely that the costs are high, or is it very likely that the costs are low, or is the percentage 50-50? Typically, you have some range of possible cost opportunities, might be an interval, or might be, in our example, typically just two values, a high value and a low value. What we always have some upper and some lower bound. Okay, and the regulator, of course, faces a participation constraint, because if the regulator says, okay, we only want to do it, I only reimburse a low cost, if it turns out that it's really a high cost project, it just won't be prosecuted, it won't be done, okay, it cannot be implemented. So the regulator always faces the participation constraint. Participation constraint just means that the rent of the firm has to be non-negative. And as always, we have an incentive for the firm to act strategically, to cheat and to tell that it's high cost. Okay, the second version is pretty much the same here. It's moral hazard. What does that mean? The firm's actual costs depend on the level of managerial effort as well. Okay, and the harder the manager works, the lower will be the firm's cost. Unfortunately, typically, it's costly for the managers to work hard. And we assume typically that the manager rather is on the golf course rather than in his or her office. Okay, and that would lead then to X inefficiency. It would lead to higher cost rather than doing hard fights with the employees. The manager says, okay, we just pay higher wages, and then in the end the regulator will allow a higher tariff, and then our, say, electricity or railway customers will pay for that. Okay, that's what we have. The problem of is that the regulator cannot observe this managerial effort directly, as always. And even if you can, as regulator, observe the cost ex post, you cannot say your costs are high. That means you didn't work hard, because it can be just to some exogenous effect which was beyond the control of the manager. Okay, typical example of moral hazard is sharecropping in developed country, where you have a tenant who works on the land of the landlord. Okay, and whether the harvest is good or bad, of course, depends on how much efforts the tenant puts in, but in particular, it depends on the weather and on the specific conditions on that land. So even though if the landlord can observe that there was a bad harvest, it cannot draw the conclusion from that the tenant didn't work hard. And the same here with our manager. So observing cost is not sufficient to know whether the manager worked hard or not. So, and again, regulator faces participation constraint, and the firm has an incentive to act strategically. So what is the optimization problem of a regulator then in this situation? Now, we need to find a regulatory mechanism where it takes these costs of these of these adverse election and moral hazard into account. And of course, it must also take into account as a constraint that we have the participation constraint, which might also have the shape of a break-even or budget balance constraint. Okay, And what we have to do is to balance the costs associated with adverse selection and the costs associated with moral hazard. This will become clear in the next slide what that means. So, of course, you always should take actions to reduce the information disadvantage. You go to the companies, you send an auditor there, and so on. You want to increase the quality of the information about the firm's cost opportunities, about demand, and so on. You might also run surveys. So, how do we deal with these kind of asymmetric information problems? We have two polar case regulatory mechanisms we already learned. Okay, the one was the cost of service regulation, where you pretty much reimburse just any cost you have, and the other was what we already had, this price cap mechanism or a fixed price regulatory contract. Okay, that's what I already described. You just set a fixed price ex ante or some pricing formula which the firm is allowed to charge. This would be just our RPI minus X. I will just write that several times because that's such a heavily used regulatory concept. So what are the important features of this regulatory mechanism? Prices do not respond to managerial effort. Okay, if you work hard or not, the price is the same. And therefore, if you work hard and if you have a lower cost and make profits, you are what is called residual claimant. If you work harder than, in a sense, expected, you have lower cost, and therefore you, on average, might get some profit, and you can then just reimburse, put that in your pocket. Okay, so you are what is called a residual claimant and production cost reductions, and also of cost increase and the cost of increase in managerial effort. Okay, and therefore. And that's an important term here. The manager and the firm has high-powered, actually here the highest powered incentives to exploit their cost opportunities. They will exert a lot of effort in order to reduce their cost opportunities, because they know if they reduce their in order to reduce their cost, not their cost opportunities, if there's cost opportunities or if there are opportunities to reduce cost, they will reduce cost. Okay. And therefore, they have an incentive to work hard, and you typically don't have a moral hazard problem. That's like if you on your own have a company which you own. Okay, of course you have an incentive to work hard because it's just your money what is in on the table. But the problem is, however, here you have the full cost of adverse selection. You have to ensure participation of the high-cost firm, and therefore a high price is necessary. So if the risk is high that the costs of a certain project, which cannot be influenced, are high, you have to pay a very high price. So even if the manager at Berlin Airport work like crazy, in principle, it might be a very high cost. Or in Gießen, if you build some house, you always have trouble with the ground because it's called Schlammbeißer, so you have a very, I don't know how you would call that in English. You probably have a lot of groundwater here, and therefore your soil is very, very poor, and that might lead to very high costs. And even if the hired company works hard like crazy, you have to account for the problem that it might turn out that you have a very high cost here. And therefore you have to pay or to account for a high cost, and therefore a high price is necessary, and that would lead to a very high rent for a low-cost firm, because you don't know, is it a high-cost or a low-cost environment? And of course, here the moral hazard problem will only change marginally, typically the high-cost or the low-cost dimension, and you don't have any rent distraction. The other polar case is our cost of service contract. Firm is just fully compensated for all the production costs. Of course, here we assume that it gets really paid, so that it's a credible commitment by the regulator, and that the audit of the costs are accurate, so the regulator can solve this information problem here. But of course, it knows that costs really occurred, but it doesn't know whether they really would or have been necessary, the related, say, works. And the point is here, the firm will reveal whether it's a high or low cost, or has to reveal here, and it doesn't get any rent of the firm due to the adverse selection problem. Okay, but the problem is the firm, if it gets reimbursed its cost anyway, it doesn't have an incentive for the management to work hard to exert more than the minimum effort, and therefore the problem is that the problem is that it won't work hard, and as firm's probability is not sensitive to managerial effort, we will get what is called managerial slack. So managers won't work hard, and we get X inefficiencies, and we get inflated costs. So workers don't work hard. We have a cozy relationship between management and employees, and so on. We might get higher wages and so on in order for the managers to avoid any trouble with the workers and so on. And so the costs associated with moral hazard are fully realized. So the problem is each of these polar mechanisms solves one of the problems, okay? But it in a sense exacerbates the other problem, and therefore an optimally or the in a sense the middle ground mechanism, which is somehow optimal in a second best sense, is this mechanism between the extremes, and this is what is called a profit sharing or a sliding scale regulatory mechanism, where the price of the regulated firm is partially responsive to changes in realized cost and partially fixed. So, and that's what I'm going to explain you in the next slide, and here starting. So we have some revenue requirement. Actually, that's the same what we discussed when we had cost of service regulation. And this revenue requirement is now not only based on realized cost. That would be here, the realized cost. It also based on some fixed component. We will later on see that this is some estimate typically of some efficient costs, like the Kosten der effizienten Leistungsbereitstellung we had in Germany, and we have some parameter B. So the point here, the B is the sharing parameter. Okay, it determines the responsiveness of the firms to the realized cost of the firm's revenues. And so these are what is called performance-based contracts, and it's easiest just to go through the detail and just consider different cases. Okay, like the case where B is equal to 1, which just means that we get the 0 here. Then the actual cost are not taken into account at all, and we just have some fixed value, and this is just a price cap regulation. And the fixed value, that's what I just told you, this C star is just some estimate or assessment of the regulator what the efficient costs of the highest cost type are. Of course, remember, we want to, or we have to make sure that we also get this service provided if it turns out that it's a high cost service. Okay, and cost of service just means service regulation A is 0, B is 0, and therefore R is just equal to C. Okay, just then the cost of service or rate of return regulation. And a performance-based mechanism would be somewhere in the middle. So it's only partially responsive to B, but it is responsive, excuse me, to C, to the realized rate, and of course then you wouldn't get reimbursed all of your C star because you get anyway paid part of the cost. And if you look into how these mechanisms work with respect to this trade-off between providing incentives and extracting rent, you know already that the fixed price, the price cap, is very good in terms of managerial incentives, but it's very bad in terms of rent extraction. Cost of service regulation is very bad in terms of providing managerial incentives, but good in terms of rent extraction, and some performance-based mechanism is somewhere in between of both. Okay. Now, of course, it depends on your project how much incentives you want to provide and whether rent extraction is the more important problem. In the notes, I gave you an example where we have some incentive contract for a Munich S-Bahn, so the local public railway transport, where you have a Bruttovertrag mit Anreizelementen. I can't discuss that in detail here, but the point is actually previous times they had contracts between the public transport authorities, the Verkehrsverbund, and the railway company, where they had so-called Nettoverträge, net contracts, where they just got reimbursed or got some subsidy, and the railway companies kept the ticket revenues. Okay, but now we have Bruttoverträge, so gross contracts, where they just get the railway company doesn't get any ticket revenues. They all go to the public transport authority, to the Verkehrsverbund, and they just get paid for running the trains. The problem is, if you just get paid for running the trains, irrespective of what the ticket revenues are, the problem is, of course, that you're not interested in getting many customers or many passengers on your train, because you're reimbursed anyway. So you might have an incentive to reduce quality, because that reduces your cost. And so that's what's described in this notes here. This Bruttovertrag mit Anreizelementen, this gross contract has some incentive effects, and they get some reimbursement if they reach some kind of utilization in terms of consumers or passengers. Yeah, so I've pretty much, that's now what I already told you. We have these optimal regulatory contract between the extremes. What might even be better is that if we don't have just one set, so we don't have just one, R is equal to A plus 1 minus B times C, but we have Ri is equal to AI, Bi, and we have a menu of regulatory contracts. If you took the IO course, this will remind you of second-degree price discrimination. Okay, this is very similar, price discrimination, and this is very similar, and it should be straightforward that if you allow the company, your regulated company, a choice, if it has a good possibilities, opportunities to reduce cost, it should take a high-powered incentive or contract. And here, of course, the managerial incentive would be important. If it's clear that it doesn't have these kind of cost opportunities, it should take another one. And these it should take the one with the lower B and the lower A. Okay. Yeah, we'll get back to the discussion of how these contracts look like and the different assumptions in the chapters 9 and 10. Okay, where we'll have different, where we'll have a menu of contracts which we offer to the regulated company, and depending on whether it's a high cost or a low cost firm, it will choose among them. Okay, I think I make a very short break here and ask for question before I move on to start and introduce the theoretical background and some notation we need in the next part. Okay, yes, there are no questions so far. This account of practical regulation and rather high-level discussion of these incentive problems should have been clear somehow, at least anyway. We will now provide the formal details or the formal background to analyze these problems in detail. So these points, this part now, which actually draws from Armstrong-Sappington's revenue or survey article in the Handbook of Industrial Organization and from Armstrong's slides, could also be called, this part, ingredients of our models. So the starting point is most of the part that our regulator is benevolent. She wants to maximize welfare. And what is welfare? The important point is now it's a weighted sum of consumer surplus, where consumer surplus is put a bit more general, because we also have to take into account that the consumer is also the taxpayer, and therefore it might be that we have to pay subsidies to the company. So of course the consumer will have to pay taxes. And of course the rent of the firm is important. And now what we get here is that welfare is simply some weighted average here of the consumers and taxpayers surplus plus alpha R. The important point here is that this alpha factor is the weight of the firm's rent. In a minute you will see why it's rent. It's just if you get a tariff, it's not, if you get a transfer, some subsidy from the firm, it's just not you're equal to your profit, because your profit might be negative, and if you receive some transfer, it might then, your rent might be zero nevertheless. Okay, the alpha. Of course, an obvious point in our total, if we look into total surplus, the standard definition we use in partial equilibrium economics, we typically assume alpha is equal to 1. Regulators don't typically assume that alpha is 1. Regulators typically assume that firms' profits are valued less than consumer welfare by the regulators. I once attended a talk by an Australian regulator, and this regulator explicitly stated, my alpha is 0. I don't care for the firm's profits. I only need to take, of course, into account the participation constraint of the firm, because I want to have this service provided, but apart from that, I only care for consumer welfare. Okay, so what are then our further ingredients? First of all, the point is, today we learned that Umsatzsteuer, that our value-added tax will be reduced. The point is, of course, if you want to pay a subsidy to some company, you need to finance it by taxes. And typically, taxes or tax revenue is does not come simply from undistorted revenues like a lump sum tax, but typically requires distorted taxation like value-added tax or like an income tax, which is distorted, and then you have administrative costs and so on. And what we introduce here is this factor, this capital lambda, and lambda is just what is called the social cost of public funds. So the point is, if you want to pay €1 in terms of transfers to the car industry, to the automotive industry, it costs the taxpayer more than €1 because we have this distortion of the taxation system and of some administrative costs and so on. And these models we have, an optimal regulation model, they either assume that alpha is smaller than 1, the weight of the rent is smaller than 1, and therefore then lambda is equal to 0, or if alpha is 1, lambda is greater than 0. In a minute you will see why that makes sense. Jean-Jacques Lafont estimated that lambda is about 0.3 in developed countries and could be much greater than 1 in less developed countries. So that is, if you want to spend, if lambda is 0.3, if you want to give €1 in terms of transfers to the car industry, it costs you €1.30 in terms of taxpayers' money. Chris Nash, at a talk he gave here at a workshop we had on railway financing, he said that the UK government only supports investments project if they earn £2 for each pound spent. In a sense, that means implicitly that the UK government assumes this lambda to be 1. What is also important, so in our ingredients, is whether the regulator can make transfers to and from the firm or not. To the firm is clear, you receive a subsidy, but from the firm just means you can tax the firms. Optimal regulation models typically assume that transfers are possible. Practical regulation models, and one example was our Ramsey-Botter pricing model, assume that you have some break-even constraint because you cannot give any transfers. And of course, if you don't give transfers anyway, Lambda doesn't play a role because you don't pay them. What is important, we typically assume that the regulator can make a take it or leave it offer. That is, all the bargaining power is with the regulator. So I don't want to spend more time on that. Then the information available to the regulator. So typically we assume, and that's just, I'm just reproducing what or restating what I had done before anyway, the information or the firm is better informed than the regulator about cost conditions, about demand conditions, about cost opportunities, so the ability to reduce cost and so on. For the moment, we assume typically that the regulator is benevolent, that is, the regulator maximizes total wealth or welfare and not its her own or his own utility. I already mentioned this problem of regulatory capture. I already also mentioned the problem or the commitment problem. Can you really state or guarantee a gas or a gas transmission operator or a company which operates a gas transmission network that they will be reimbursed their new investment, which has a useful lifetime of 50 years? Will it be reimbursed over the next 50 years? Can you commit to what is called long-term policies? Okay, now finally we got to some equations again. You will see that this is very close now at the moment. This is just to introduce some notation here. We already did that more or less, but you will see we will apply this approach very similarly once we start to model models of asymmetric information. So we have a setup very similar to our Ramsey-Bourdieu setup. We just have n products with n different prices. We take into account consumer surplus and denote it as V of P. We denote profit as pi of P, and we pay a transfer from the consumer who finance that to the firms. And of course, we have a non-negativity constraint with respect to the firm's rent. And the firm's rent is simply, as I told you already, it's profit plus T. A simple point here, suppose price is equal marginal cost, then the profit would be equal to, or actually the loss would be equal to the fixed cost, and then of course a transfer at the level of the fixed cost would just guarantee that the rent is non-negative. In terms of consumer surplus or surplus of our consumer taxpayers here, it's just this consumer surplus in a narrowly defined sense minus what it has to pay in transfer to the firms, and taking into account that €1 of transfer costs you €1.30 if the lambda is 0.3, so because due to the social cost of public funds due to the distorted taxation system. Okay, should be clear. So we just define unless here probably I should ask some time where it more confuses you if I draw this line. Okay, yeah, then our welfare function, which our benevolent regulator wants to maximize, is simply S plus alpha R. Again, our weighted average of consumer surplus plus the firm's, not producer surplus, but the firm's rent. And here we just substitute the above definitions. Okay, consumer surplus V minus the tax costs in a sense, or the transfer cost, plus alpha times the rent of the firms. And now what we now see immediately, our first result will be the following. If transfers are feasible, our case 2 will be transfers are not feasible, we will see it's optimal to pay as little transfer as possible and to guarantee that the rent is 0. We want to extract all firm profit and use it to reduce the tax burden if either alpha is smaller than 1 or lambda is greater than 0. And this can be seen immediately. I think I have the W here once again, so it's easier to look into the derivative here. We just take the derivative with respect to transfer. How does welfare change if we pay €1 more in terms of a transfer to the firm? Yeah, here you see, that's why I reproduced it here. If we take the derivative with respect to t, you see t ends here, so we get a -1 plus lambda here, and t enters here, so we get a plus alpha here. But note, if alpha is, suppose lambda is equal to 0 and alpha is smaller than 1, it's smaller than 0 if alpha is 1 and lambda is greater than 0, it's also negative. So if either alpha is smaller than 1 or lambda is greater than 0, if either the weight of the firms in the social welfare function is smaller than 1, smaller than the consumer's weight, or we have this social cost of public funds, we want to pay as little transfer as possible, because each reduction by €1 in terms of transfer will increase welfare. And that means we want to pay as little transfer, or if the firms, so we want to have an R equal to 0, and even if the prices give rise to some profit for the firm, we want to tax the firm, okay? And simply, if R is equal to 0, we know that R is equal to pi plus T. We know that the transfer is just equal to minus the profit, okay? And if we substitute that here in this welfare function, what we get is just Vp plus 1 plus lambda pi p. So we just can get rid of the transfer here. And if lambda is 0, we simply maximize total surplus. Okay? But of course, now we always have that R is equal to 0 in this surplus function. And of course, you know, if transfer are costly, if lambda is 0, we would get marginal cost pricing and a transfer according to fixed cost, that is according to losses. You will see that on the next slide where we derive this result formally, and this is in a sense our standard textbook result if you go into any or look into any intermediate microeconomics textbook. Okay, now if lambda is greater than 0, prices will be above marginal cost. And in order to illustrate that, I just look into a single product case where it's simply P minus C times Q. This profit here, I somehow forgot the fixed cost. Actually, you will see they don't matter once we pay the transfer. And in particular, they don't matter here for the optimal prices because they are not part or they will drop out anyway once. I think I just add the fixed cost here. It wouldn't matter. They drop out anyway once we take a derivative. And the derivative is straightforward. Okay, you previously saw it's just a derivative of the standard narrow-defined consumer surplus and the profit of the firm. And that's you know that if we take the derivative of the consumer surplus with respect to P, we get minus Q. And here, this is nothing else than, in a sense, yeah, it's not marginal revenue, but it's the analogous term if you take the derivative of profit with respect to the price. So that's straightforward. If you take the first the derivative with respect to this P, you get Q. If you take the derivative, so applying product rule, the derivative of with respect to P, you get the P minus C times Q prime. So straightforward here. And that means we can rearrange that. What you see here, the minus Q drops out against this first Q here. You just rearrange it, put that on the other side. You have some 1 plus lambda here and some lambda Q here. That's why you get this. And you put it in terms of the learner index. Okay, eta is as always the price elasticity of demand. And I don't want to do it right now, but you see immediately you can now really derive that that you get a very nice, actually inverse elasticity rules, which looks or completely identical to the rule we derived for the Ramsey in the Ramsey-Boteux model. However, in the Ramsey-Boteux model, our lambda was endogenous, as I will show you again in the next page. So the price, and now what now is interesting is how does the price cost margin react to the lambda. Remember, what is lambda? Lambda is the cost, social cost of public funds, the cost of the tax distortion. Okay, so what is always clear here, we don't need to discuss that in more detail, what the effect of the demand elasticity eta is. If demand elasticity is higher, if demand is elastic, we get a low markup. If demand is inelastic, we get a high markup. But the interesting thing is lambda. First of all, in our standard textbook case, we would have lambda is equal to 0, and therefore, if lambda is 0, lambda enters in the numerator, we would just get the result I just mentioned, prices equal marginal cost. You see, nowhere we get nowhere we do get the fixed cost. They are just covered then by, I think I should put that away. They are just covered by a transfer. So that's why I didn't put them up here, but I think I will add them in the next version. Okay, but the point is, suppose you are in some developing country where you don't have any tax system. What does that mean? You don't have any income tax system, you need revenue. So what are you doing? You have an electricity company which is state owned, and your lambda is actually infinity. Okay, if lambda is infinite, you would get infinity divided by infinity, which is actually 1 here. The limit would be 1, and you would get P minus C over P is 1 over eta. But this is nothing else than the monopoly solution. So, and what would you do? You would charge a price equal to the monopoly price, and you would then just tax the company, and this would then be your transfer revenue. Okay? Yeah. And so in that respect, it's rather interesting. In the assignment, we will just have a problem where you calculate these values depending on different values of lambda. Okay, and what I already told you actually is that lambda here is even though the equation or formula is exactly the same as the Ramsey-Boteux price formula, the lambda is something different here, as it's not the shadow price of the firm's budget constraint and therefore affected by the fixed cost, but it's a marginal cost of raising government revenue and distributing revenue to the firm. Okay? So the optimal prices here have just an allocation function here, and you use then public funds to just make sure that the rent of the firm is non-negative. Okay, yeah. Now, if we have the other case, transfers are not feasible, and the firm has increasing returns to scale. Of course, we cannot get marginal cost. We get the standard kind of Ramsey-Boteux pricing, and actually what we already saw, we just maximize social welfare. Lambda doesn't play a role, and we subject to this pi equals 0, and if lambda is the Lagrange multiplier associated with the constraint pi, we just can rearrange that. So this was exactly our problem we previously had. We maximize social welfare, taking into account this. If that's a constraint, we just can add this with the lambda here, and it looks exactly the same as the problem we had on the previous page. Okay, exactly the same problem. That's what we have here. Here we already have the derivative, and of course we get the same result. However, even though the two problems take the same form, the only difference is that in the former case, lambda is exogenous, the capital lambda is exogenous, and here our small lambda is endogenous, and it's chosen to make the firm break even. And of course, you will see it depends on fixed costs. That's what we will going to discuss in the next in the next assignment. So that was our, in a sense, preliminaries we need in order now to introduce our models of asymmetric information, where we are going to start with adverse selection, and I will make a short break here. Yeah, so welcome back to our lecture, regulation under adverse selection. That will be our next point, and here we really cover interesting ground, I think, as I already told you, Roger Myerson and one of his problems, and we will present one of or discuss one of his most important contributions here, and he received the Nobel Prize for that. Yeah, so our starting point is what we just discussed here. Welfare is just consumer surplus here in the extended sense, including tax payments, plus alpha times the firm's rent, and we assume no social cost of public funds. And actually our first model we look into in detail is the Baer-Myerson model from, I think it was in Econometrica 1982. And it's a model of what is adverse selection. In a minute, I will tell you, I first tell you what the Baer-Myerson model is about. So what the Baer-Myerson model assumes is that the regulator does not know what the marginal, so the variable production cost of the regulated companies are. And so they are unobserved by the regulator. And there is a certain probability that these costs are low, CL, and of course with the probability 1 minus phi, the converse probability, they would be high. So what does the regulator know? The regulator only knows the distribution of marginal cost, but does not know the exact marginal cost. In the original model of Baer-Myerson, I think it was not just a binary choice where we had both low and high cost, but it was an interval, some interval between CL and CH, and the regulator only knows the distribution over this probability distribution, but we take here the simpler approach with only either high or low cost, and you will see we can learn a lot from that. So the point is, the regulator is not informed about a very important characteristic of the firm, and this is the marginal cost. And the fixed cost is common knowledge in this model, as is also consumer demand. Okay, here just a note on terminology. Here we call this an adverse selection model. Mascolel, Winston Green in her microeconomics analysis textbook or graduate textbook, as well as I think Bolton and, I forgot who the second author of the contract theory is at the moment. In this contract theory, they call such a model a principal agent model with hidden information. Principal agent, of course, here in our model, we always, or in these models of asymmetric information, we always assume that the regulator is the so-called principal, the regulated company is the agent. And here hidden information should be clear because the agent hides information from about the marginal cost from the regulated company. A short aside here, adverse selection is used by Mascolel, Winston Green, for instance, for the original Akerlof model, model of lemons, where they apply this problem to a competitive market, and where you have, say, for instance, many workers, you don't know as an employer whether the productivity of a worker you want to hire is high or low. There is a certain population with a certain share of high high productive and low productive workers, and the problem is which might arise here. You're only willing to pay an average wage, therefore, which is some average of a high productivity and a low productivity. And yeah, the problem is, of course, the high productive worker won't be willing to accept this wage which is below her productivity, and therefore you might end up in a market, or that the market is unraveling. You don't get any transactions. I don't have the time to spend or to deal with that in more detail here, but I just recommend to you to look into the original Akerlof model. We want to proceed here with our Baron-Myers model. Of course, it should be clear that this might be a potentially interesting or important kind of asymmetric information. You don't know the information about the marginal cost. Is it important also in our context of network industries? I think I just wanted to show you that here. Remember our slides. I only had the time to go through that very shortly, but oops, I just made, oh, that was really bad. We had that here you see what the direct costs are, which are unmittelbare Kosten des Subbetriebs, which are close to marginal cost. That was DB Netz, the infrastructure manager of the network, told the Bundesnetzagentur, and here you see some numbers. Does a very heavy train really cause marginal cost of 2.337 euros per kilometer? Okay, is that really so? Do we know that? Okay, so here we really might have something like asymmetric information on marginal cost. I just have to try to find my previous slide here. I think here we are. Yeah, and the other case would have been our water treatment we had in Sydney. So here again you see water purchase and treatment. This is probably something like variable cost, because how much or what your treatment costs are probably depends on how much water you treat. And does a regulator really know whether this 1.9 billion Austrian dollar or the treatment cost, is this a real ones? Okay, so here we have two examples of where we might have this problem, or this kind of asymmetric information. Of course, we start with the first kind. Then Louis Seppington came up in 1989 with an other version. So if you think marginal costs are known to the regulator, or unknown to the regulator, why should the fixed costs be known to the regulator? And what they assume is just that both marginal and fixed costs are unobserved by the regulator. Okay, but however they make some assumption, and the assumption here is that the regulator does not know what marginal or fixed costs are, but what the regulator knows is that if fixed costs are high, or then marginal costs will be low. So the low cost company, the low operating cost company is the one with the high investment cost. And if the fixed costs are low or the production costs are high, the fixed costs will be low. Okay, just think of our electricity networks. In Germany, we have all our local electricity cables underground. Okay, in the US, you have overhead lines. Of course, for overhead lines, you have much lower investment cost, but much higher maintenance costs, because if the wind is a bit more heavy, you will have some power outages and so on. So here you see how it might look like. So this is a Louis Seppington model. What I'm doing right now is I just explain you, first of all, these different setups, these different kinds of adverse selection or of asymmetric information problems. And in the next step, hopefully I managed to do that today. In the next step, I will tell you how to solve these problems. Okay, how to find the optimal mechanism, how to find the optimal contract. The Lafont-Tirol model from 86 assumes that the marginal costs can be observed by the regulator, but these marginal costs are endogenous. And the point is, the regulator does not know the trade-off between fixed cost and marginal cost. So what you know is, if you invest more, you get lower. If you invest more in terms of fixed costs, make a higher investment, you get a lower marginal cost. But the regulator does not know whether the effort required, or whether this investment required is high or low. And again, you have some probability that the firm is of low type, is some fine. Just to give you an example, which will show up in, I think, some assignment 8 or 9 here. Just think you assume that the government thinks about building some Transrapid or high-speed railway connection between Munich and Hamburg. And of course, what you can observe is the marginal cost. What does this mean? If you use the airline distance, okay, straight line between Munich and Hamburg, it will be, of course, it will be the lowest marginal cost, because the marginal cost would be just the time the passenger takes to get from Munich to Hamburg. And if you have a straight line, the marginal costs are lowest. But the point is, you don't know how much investment that requires. Typically, if marginal costs are higher, if you make I don't know whether I can illustrate it here. Suppose this is Hamburg, this is Munich. Okay, this is Munich. If you have a straight line, you have to build many tunnels, many bridges, and so on. The cost will be very high, but you might also, circumvent some or might go through some valleys. Of course, now you have higher marginal cost, because the length of this connection is longer. And the point is, however, that the investment cost will be lower, because you have to build fewer tunnels and fewer bridges. Now the point is, what you don't know here is actually whether the cost to build a straight line are high or low, and whether the costs are how high or how low are they. Okay, they will be different. I will make clear that later on. And finally, is it already finally? Now we had differences in marginal cost, or marginal cost unknown, fixed cost and marginal cost unknown. In a sense, investment cost or necessary investment to reach a certain marginal cost are unknown. And finally, we get that demand is unobserved by the regulator. And demand might be either high or low, and you just don't know the state of demand, and the probability of low demand is phi. As always, if you have any questions, just put them into the chat. Okay, now we start with how we analyze these kinds of adverse selection models. Mostly I will illustrate how we proceed with the Baer-Myers model, even though I'm going to present you in a few minutes some general approach how you can solve these models. So what is a basic model or the basic problem in the Baer-Myers? You start with this exogenous marginal cost, where you as a regulator do not know are they high or low. You only know that the probability that they are low is phi, say 40%, and you know the fixed cost. And now what you are doing is you set some contract, okay? And the contract consists of a price and a transfer. And how would the full information solution look like? Now that's very straightforward here. Of course, the full information solution would be full information. You know that the costs are high. If they are high, you would just set pH and PL, and your contracts, so contract for full information would just consist, so full information here, full information, the contract would just be, or you would have the two contracts here, PH and oh, I should put it differently, PH equal CH and F equal T. That would be contract 1, and you would have another contract PL equals CL F equal T. Okay, that would be just your two contracts under full information. Whatever notation you're going to use, it doesn't matter, but it should be rather clear here. Okay. The problem is now what happens if we have asymmetric information. We have now what is important, a participation constraint and incentive compatibility constraint. Incentive compatibility constraint just means you have to provide incentives so that the firm really wants to truthfully reveal its information. Now, just assume what happens if you offer these contracts in the situation where you have asymmetric information. If you were to offer these full information contracts, what would happen? Of course, you would if the firm really is of a high type, its participation constraint would be satisfied. Okay, it would be satisfied because it makes zero profit. It gets price equal marginal cost and a transfer equal to the fixed cost, so everything is fine. But what about the low cost type? Now, actually, if the low cost type truthfully reveals its type, it would get this contract with price equal marginal cost, PL equals CL, and then it would make losses equal to F, and this would be covered for T. So its profits are, of course, zero. But if it claims to be of the high type, remember that the regulator doesn't know whether it's a high type or a low type. What will happen? Now, it just tells you that it's a high type, that it has high cost. Okay. Okay. Now, if it tells you what is the profit it gains, the rent it gets, if it tells you that it's a high type, it just gets this rent here, okay? Because, of course, then the regulator will give you a price equal to CH. You receive a transfer equal to your fixed cost, and, of course, you make then these operating profit. Okay? Oh, that's not really a nice illustration, but here you see you make this profit here. Okay, so you have an incentive to cheat if the regulator just offers these full information contracts. So does it make sense to induce truthful revelation? Does it make sense to take into account the incentive compatibility constraint? That's what the next sentence tells you. It's generally welfare increasing to account for both the participation constraint and the incentive compatibility constraint. I can easily show you that, hopefully, here. Oh, I don't know whether orange is so much better. What you would have to pay in order for the firm, for the low-cost firm, to truthfully reveal its type, you would have to pay a further transfer, which really, information rent, that's what we call it, so that it really gets an information rent for its superior knowledge. And does it make sense? Now, if you tell, or if you are willing as a regulator to pay this rectangle in terms of an information rent, so the contract would be here just now PL is equal to CL, okay, and now your transfer would be F plus, now what is the plus? The plus is just this rectangle, okay, is this rectangle. In this case, what we typically assume, if you have the same rent, if you tell the truth, and if you cheat, even then you will tell the truth. Okay. So if you pay that, the regulator will, the low-cost firm will be willing to accept this contract. And what is your social welfare? What is the welfare your consumers get? Yeah, your consumers, orange is really a bad color here. I take blue. Your consumers then will be able to realize this triangle. Okay. In addition, in the case if the regulated company is of a low type, okay, the consumers don't get the red rectangle, they have to pay that as a transfer, but previously they just wouldn't have got it because this the low-cost firm just would have told them that that they are high cost and therefore the price would be PH anyway, okay, but now they have to pay the transfer, but here now we realize this this welfare increase justice triangle. This is not yet the optimal solution, but hopefully you got some idea how these models work in principle and in particular what the incentive compatibility constraint implies. Okay, yeah, now I did that, I invested some time because what I'm doing now is rather abstract. This is a rather formal and abstract approach to the problem, but hopefully you'll nevertheless get the idea. So we want now to provide a unified framework. This is actually the framework, of course, Armstrong and Sepping used in the survey article, where we start with our standard problem, binary information. The state is either L or H, that is either low or high of the firm. So remember, in all 4 different cases, we had either high or low marginal cost, high or low marginal and fixed cost, this combination, or the Lafont-Tirol model, or either high or low demand. There is some exogenous probability phi of the low state, and the firm's probability is defined as pi. And we have some contract for the firm I, which is just made up of a price I and a transfer Ti. Okay, remember PL and T equal to fixed cost in the full information outcome, for instance. And again, of course, the important definition here is that the firms have some rent, which is equal to pi plus the transfer. And now what we have to introduce is a very important thing. This is delta pi p. This is the profit difference in firms' profit in state H compared to state L, given the regulated prices. Okay, it's simply what is the difference in profits if we have the same prices. Here the P's are the same, and what does the high type get compared to what does the low type get. Actually, in the previous case, this was just our red rectangle, okay? And this is simply, our rectangle we had is CL minus CH. Actually, of course, it's negative here because the price of the high cost type, the profit of the high cost type is always lower than the profit of the low cost type. So very often our delta pi p will be negative. And here you see as low costs are lower than high cost, of course, here this will be negative, but this is just our rectangle we had on our red rectangle we had on the previous slide. And of course, here we assume also that we can have other prices than, say, here in the where we had the rectangle. We assume that the price we looked into was PCH, okay? That was the price we considered in the previous case, but now we just allow for general prices and look for general prices and look only into the profit difference. And you see, if we have general prices, the only thing which changes, we always get, because this P always drops out, we always get this difference between a low cost and a high cost. The only difference is the QP, and the demand you have, and that will be very important when we derive the result. Okay, and I think here I just want to illustrate this once again, because you will see another of my diagrams here. So the difference in profit is often but not always negative. You will see in the Lewis-Stepington model with the fixed and marginal cost, it will not always be negative. But here you see that's what I already derived in the Baron-Meyerson model. It's negative. And this is now really the most important part. This delta pi p will very often be increasing in p. Okay? That means the difference in profits comes smaller if P increases. Increasing in P, note that these are negative numbers, and increase means in absolute terms it gets smaller. Okay? And remember, this rectangle, the red rectangle, was just the incentive to cheat, incentive to misrepresent decreases. So this is the last part I want to do today, and then I'm finished, so I ask for your patience for another 2 minutes here, because you already know that. It's exactly the same thing. So if you have price equal, if you have PH equals CH, this is just, this rectangle is just what we get. Okay? And of course, I don't know whether I had it, and of course you will get then, this would be then just Q of CH. And what you get is just, I don't know whether you can read it, but I told you. So that's just the rectangle, the incentive to cheat, the profit difference, okay, in negative terms, the profit difference between the two types, okay? And the point is, now what happens if we increase pH? Okay, what happens if we increase pH? Now you see, if we have pH, what you will see here, now the firm, the high type, of course, would make this blue area as profit. And of course, you just, as a regulator, you know now this firm makes this profit, so you reduce the transfer from the transfer equal to fixed cost to a transfer, okay, transfer to the high guy would now be fixed cost minus blue rectangle, okay? Oh, blue. Okay? That's what you would pay. And now you see the profit difference is then just the green area. And that's the important point. What you can do is, as a regulator, if you distort the decision, if you don't offer a price equal to marginal cost to the high type, what you will do is you can reduce the rent of the low type. So, and that's the important part why this delta pi p is so important, and why the sign of this derivative is so important. If the profit difference, and therefore the incentive to cheat decreases, if you increase the price, you have an incentive, or you have an instrument to reduce the rent of the low type, what is called the information rent. So the green rectangle is clearly smaller than the original red one. And what you will see here, if this property holds in equilibrium, you as a regulator will choose that, of course, first of all, the price is higher, the high price is higher than the low price. Okay, I think I'm going to leave it as this, because time ran out. I'm available on WebEx for some more discussion and for some more questions. I thank you again for being with me here, and look forward to your questions. Thank you and goodbye.